May 2nd, 1968. 0630 hours. Loc Ninh, South Vietnam. Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez lay on the ground in a jungle clearing, bleeding from 37 separate wounds. 7 bullets had punctured his body, through his legs, his arms, his back. 28 pieces of shrapnel were embedded in his flesh from grenades and mortar rounds that had exploded within meters of where he'd been fighting. A bayonet had been driven completely through his back, between his ribs, and out through his chest. His jaw was shattered from a rifle butt to the face. His right leg was broken, and his intestines were protruding from a wound in his stomach, held inside his body only by his blood-soaked uniform shirt that he'd been clutching closed for the past 3 hours. Around him, 8 wounded American soldiers were still breathing, still alive, because Roy Benavidez had refused to let them die. He'd jumped from a helicopter into a kill zone surrounded by more than 1,000 North Vietnamese Army soldiers. He'd pulled wounded men to safety while being shot. He'd called in airstrikes while bleeding from multiple wounds. He'd fought off NVA soldiers with his knife when his rifle jammed. He'd distributed ammunition to defenders while his own intestines were hanging out of his body. And he'd loaded 8 wounded men onto an extraction helicopter one by one, carrying them when they couldn't walk, dragging them when he couldn't carry them, crawling when he couldn't walk. The extraction helicopter was 50 meters away, rotors spinning, pilots screaming over the radio for everyone to get aboard immediately before NVA forces overran their position. The 8 wounded soldiers were aboard. The bodies of the dead had been loaded. Medical corpsmen were doing a final sweep of the area, looking for anyone they'd missed. They found Roy lying in the mud, motionless, covered in blood, eyes closed. They assumed he was dead. Nobody could survive 37 wounds. They'd seen men die from single bullet wounds. Roy had been shot 7 times, stabbed with a bayonet, beaten with rifle butts, and hit with shrapnel from more grenades and mortars than anyone had counted. He should have been dead hours ago. A medic knelt beside Roy, checking for vital signs. No pulse detected. No breathing visible. The medic reached for a body bag. Roy Benavidez, with 37 wounds, barely conscious, with his intestines outside his body, summoned every ounce of strength remaining in his destroyed body, and did the only thing he could think of to prove he was still alive. He spat blood in the medic's face. The medic jumped back, startled, then started screaming for help. Other corpsmen rushed over. They found a pulse, weak, thready, but present. They found breathing, shallow, ragged, but there, Roy Benavidez was alive. They loaded him onto the helicopter. As the aircraft lifted off, taking fire from NVA soldiers closing on a landing zone, the pilot looked back at the carnage in his cargo bay. 8 wounded soldiers, 4 dead soldiers, and 1 man who should have been dead, but somehow, impossibly, was still breathing. Later, when doctors at the field hospital examined Roy's wounds, they would tell him he'd lost approximately 40% of his blood volume. They would count 37 separate wounds requiring treatment. They would perform multiple surgeries to repair damage to his intestines, stomach, legs, arms, and face. They would tell him he was extraordinarily lucky to be alive. Roy would tell them luck had nothing to do with it. He'd made a promise to himself 6 hours earlier when he jumped from that helicopter. Nobody dies today. Not on his watch. This is the story of Roy Benavidez, the orphan who became a warrior, the man doctors said would never walk again who ran into combat, the soldier who took 37 wounds and refused to die, and the hero who had to fight for 10 years to receive the recognition he'd earned in 6 hours of hell. It's the story of a man who spent his entire life proving wrong everyone who said he couldn't, wouldn't, or shouldn't. Raul Perez Benavidez. He wouldn't become Roy until he joined the Army. Was born on August 5th, 1935 in Cuero, Texas, a small town about 90 miles southeast of San Antonio. He was born into a Mexican-American family in an era and place where being Mexican-American meant being second-class citizens in your own country. His father, Salvador Benavidez Jr., was a sharecropper working land owned by white farmers, earning barely enough to feed his family. His mother, Teresa Perez, worked alongside Salvador in the fields when she wasn't caring for the children. The family lived in a small wooden shack without electricity or running water. Typical housing for Mexican-American farm workers in 1930s Texas. The Benavidez family spoke Spanish at home. Raul learned English only when he started school, where speaking Spanish was forbidden and often punished. Teachers would hit students with rulers for speaking their native language. Other children, white children, would mock the Mexican kids for their accents, their poverty, their appearance. Raul learned early that the world was divided into those who had power and those who didn't, and Mexican Americans definitely didn't. When Raul was 7 years old, his mother died of tuberculosis. TB was a death sentence for poor families in 1942. There was no cure, no effective treatment, just a slow, painful decline. Teresa had probably been sick for months or years before she finally succumbed, working in the fields despite her illness because the family needed her income. Her death left Salvador with multiple children to feed and no way to care for them while working the fields. 6 months later, Salvador died in a farming accident. The details were never clear. Farm accidents involving Mexican laborers weren't investigated thoroughly in 1940s Texas, but the result was undeniable. At age 7, Raul Benavidez was an orphan. Raul and his younger brother Roger were taken in by their aunt and uncle, Salvador and Alexandria Coy, who lived in El Campo, Texas, about 15 miles from Cuero. The Coys were sharecroppers themselves, barely making enough to support their own children. 2 more mouths to feed was a burden, but family took care of family, even when they could barely take care of themselves. Life with the Coys meant work. Constant, exhausting, never-ending work. Raul was in the cotton fields by age 7, picking cotton alongside adult workers. He'd wake before dawn, work all day in brutal Texas heat, and return home after dark. During cotton picking season, late summer through fall, there was no school, no play, no childhood. There was only work. The work was physically brutal for a child. Cotton bolls had sharp spines that cut fingers and hands. The cotton sack you dragged behind you could weigh 100 pounds when full. The heat in Texas cotton fields regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water breaks were infrequent. Bathroom breaks were wherever you could find a moment. And at the end of a week where you'd worked dawn to dusk 7 days straight, a Mexican child might earn $5 or $10, barely enough to contribute to family survival. But Raul learned things in those cotton fields that would later save his life and the lives of others. He learned to endure physical discomfort, heat, thirst, hunger, exhaustion, without complaining. He learned to keep working when his body screamed to stop. He learned that toughness wasn't about being strong. It was about refusing to quit regardless of how much something hurt. He learned, in the words he would use decades later, that pain is temporary, but quitting lasts forever. School, when he could attend, was a different kind of suffering. The El Campo school system was segregated in practice, if not in law. Mexican-American children attended separate schools, received used textbooks and equipment that white schools had discarded, and were taught by teachers who often viewed them as future farm laborers who didn't need much education. Teachers told Mexican children explicitly that they shouldn't bother with higher education, that they should focus on learning trades that would allow them to work on farms or in factories. Raul struggled academically. He spoke Spanish at home, English at school, and never fully mastered either. Reading was difficult. Math was frustrating. Teachers assumed he was slow rather than recognizing he was trying to learn in his second language while working 50 to 60 hours per week in cotton fields. By 8th grade, Raul was failing most of his classes. His uncle couldn't read or write, couldn't help with homework, and needed Raul in the fields more than in school. At age 15, in 1950, Raul Benavidez dropped out of school. He went to work full-time in the cotton fields, joining the ranks of thousands of Mexican-American teenagers for whom education was a luxury their families couldn't afford. He would later describe himself as functionally illiterate when he left school, able to read simple text but unable to write much beyond his own name. For the next 5 years, from age 15 to 20, Raul worked as a farm laborer, a sharecropper, and eventually as a day laborer, taking whatever work he could find. He picked cotton, harvested vegetables, worked construction, and did any job that paid a few dollars. The work was hard, the pay was terrible, and the future looked exactly like the present. Endless work, endless poverty, endless marginalization. But something happened in those years that changed Raul's trajectory. He watched his younger brother Roger get drafted into the U.S. Army. Roger, who was smaller than Raul, who'd grown up in the same poverty, who'd picked the same cotton, came back from his Army service different. He'd learned to trade. He'd traveled beyond Texas. He'd earned respect from people who didn't know or care that he was Mexican-American. The Army, Roger told Raul, didn't care about your ethnicity or where you came from. It cared about whether you could do the job. In 1955, at age 19, Raul Perez Benavidez walked into an Army recruiting office in El Campo, Texas, and enlisted. The recruiter looked at the skinny Mexican kid who could barely read and asked what he wanted to do in the Army. Raul's answer was simple: I want to be airborne. The recruiter probably laughed. Airborne, paratroopers, were elite soldiers, the toughest men in the Army, volunteers who jumped out of airplanes behind enemy lines. They weren't skinny Mexican farm workers who could barely read. But the Army in 1955 was still expanding from the Korean War, still needed bodies, and was willing to take pretty much anyone who was physically fit and willing to serve. At basic training at Fort Ord, California, Raul Benavidez encountered racial attitudes that were both better and worse than what he'd experienced in Texas. The Army was officially integrated. President Truman had ordered military integration in 1948, but that didn't mean racism had disappeared. Some soldiers and NCOs still viewed Mexican Americans as inferior. Some drill sergeants made racist comments. Some fellow trainees assumed Raul was stupid because of his accent and limited education. But the Army also operated on a principle that mattered more than racism: performance. If you could shoot straight, if you could march 20 miles with a full pack, if you could follow orders and complete missions, you got respect. Your ethnicity mattered less than your ability to do the job. For Raul, who'd spent his entire life being judged by his ethnicity and dismissed because of his poverty, this was revolutionary. Raul excelled at basic training. The physical training that broke some recruits, long runs, obstacle courses, force marches, was easy compared to 12-hour days picking cotton in 100-degree heat. The discipline that frustrated others, following orders, maintaining equipment, showing up on time, came naturally to someone who'd been working since age 7. The weapons training, the tactics, the field exercises. This was the first time in Raul's life that he'd been trained for something other than agricultural labor. He qualified as expert with the M1 rifle. He finished near the top of his class in physical training. He impressed his instructors with his determination and his willingness to help other soldiers who were struggling. When basic training ended, Raul volunteered for Airborne School at Fort Benning, Georgia. Airborne School was designed to break you. 3 weeks of intensive training culminating in 5 parachute jumps from aircraft flying at 1,200 feet. The physical training was brutal: runs, push-ups, pull-ups, drills designed to exhaust soldiers and test their determination. The mental pressure was constant. Instructors screaming, questioning whether you had what it took to be airborne, offering you opportunities to quit that were really tests to see if you would quit. Raul didn't quit. He completed every run, every drill, every exercise. He made his 5 jumps, including one night jump that terrified him, but that he completed anyway. He earned his airborne wings, the silver badge that marked him as a paratrooper, a member of an elite community that crossed ethnic and social boundaries. If you were airborne, you were airborne. Nothing else mattered. It was around this time that Raul started going by Roy. The Army bureaucracy had difficulty with Spanish names. Commanders and NCOs mispronounced Raul constantly. Someone, Roy never remembered who, started calling him Roy, an Americanized version that was easier for English speakers. Roy accepted the name change pragmatically. If an American name made life easier in an American institution, fine. He was still Raul to his family. He was Roy to the Army. After Airborne School, Roy was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He served as an infantryman, learning his trade, building skills, proving himself. The 82nd in the 1950s was America's strategic reserve, the rapid deployment force that would be first to respond to any crisis. Training was constant and demanding. Standards were high, but Roy thrived. In 1959, Roy volunteered for Special Forces, the Green Berets, an even more elite unit focused on unconventional warfare, foreign internal defense, and special reconnaissance. Special Forces candidates had to pass a grueling selection course, demonstrate aptitude for language learning and cultural adaptation, and show the intelligence and initiative to operate independently in hostile territory. Many candidates failed. Roy passed. He completed Special Forces training and earned the Green Beret that marked him as one of the Army's most capable soldiers. He learned Spanish formally. Ironic that the Army was teaching him his native language, along with basic Vietnamese. He learned weapons, tactics, survival skills, medical procedures. He became, in military terminology, a force multiplier. One Special Forces soldier could train and lead indigenous forces numbering in the hundreds. In 1965, Roy deployed to South Vietnam for his first combat tour. The war was escalating rapidly. American combat troops had recently been deployed in large numbers. Special Forces were operating throughout the country, advising South Vietnamese forces, running reconnaissance missions, and occasionally engaging in direct combat with Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces. Roy's first tour was successful. He conducted missions, led indigenous troops, earned commendations for his performance. He was promoted to Staff Sergeant. He earned the Combat Infantryman Badge, awarded only to soldiers who'd been in direct ground combat. He proved he could handle the stress, the danger, the ambiguity of counterinsurgency warfare. Then, in 1965, Roy stepped on a landmine. He was leading a patrol near the Cambodian border when a buried mine detonated beneath him. The explosion threw Roy several meters, shattered his right leg, sent shrapnel into his back and legs. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a military hospital in Japan, then finally to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, for extended treatment and rehabilitation. Doctors examined Roy's injuries and delivered a verdict. His combat days were over. The damage to his back was severe, multiple vertebrae fractured, muscles torn, nerve damage extensive. The leg injury was serious enough that walking would be difficult. Return to active duty as a Special Forces soldier, requiring parachute jumps, long-distance runs, carrying heavy equipment, was impossible. Roy would likely be medically retired from the Army. Roy was 29 years old. The Army had been his escape from poverty, his path to respect, his family, and his identity. Being told he couldn't be a soldier anymore was like being told he couldn't exist. Doctors told Roy he might never walk normally again. Physical therapy would help, but full recovery was unlikely. He should accept his limitations, take the medical retirement, and move on with his life. Roy Benavidez heard what the doctors said. Then he decided they were wrong. Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, Texas, 1966. Roy spent months in the hospital, undergoing surgeries to repair his shattered leg and damaged back. The pain was extraordinary. The metal pins and plates holding his bones together caused chronic aches. Physical therapy was agonizing, trying to bend joints that didn't want to bend, trying to strengthen muscles that had atrophied, try to walk on a leg that had been reconstructed with metal hardware. The doctors and physical therapists were professional and competent. They helped Roy regain basic functionality. Within a few months, Roy could walk with a cane. Within 6 months, he could walk without the cane, though with a pronounced limp. He could perform basic daily activities. By medical standards, Roy's recovery was successful, but Roy wasn't interested in meeting medical standards. He was interested in returning to Special Forces, which required passing a physical fitness test that included running 2 miles in under 16 minutes, doing dozens of push-ups and sit-ups, and jumping out of airplanes. Medical personnel told Roy this was unrealistic. His injuries were too severe. He should be grateful he could walk at all, and accept that his combat career was over. Roy listened politely. Then he started training secretly at night. After the hospital staff went home, after other patients were asleep, Roy would sneak out his room and work out in an empty physical therapy room. He couldn't run. His leg wouldn't support it. He could barely do a push-up. His back screamed in protest. But Roy had learned something in those Texas cotton fields 20 years earlier. You don't have to be strong to start. You just have to start and refuse to quit. He started with simple exercises. Stretching to improve flexibility. Bodyweight squats to strengthen his legs. Modified push-ups using his knees instead of his toes. Core exercises to rebuild abdominal and back strength. He worked for hours every night, slowly, painfully, ignoring the warning signals his body was sending. Progress was measured in millimeters. 1 week, he could do 5 push-ups. 2 weeks later, 10. A month later, 15. His leg hurt constantly, but the limp became less pronounced. His back ached every morning, but the range of motion improved. Doctors noticed Roy's improvement during physical therapy sessions and assumed it was their professional interventions working. They didn't know Roy was putting in 3 times the work they prescribed. After 6 months of secret training, Roy decided to test himself. He went to the base physical fitness area early one morning. Before other soldiers were up, he tried to run 2 miles. He made about 400 meters before his leg gave out and he collapsed. But he'd run 400 meters. Doctors had said he'd never run again. Roy figured 400 meters was a start. He kept training. Every night, secret workouts. Every morning, attempting to run a little further. His leg hurt constantly, probably re-injuring tissues that should have been allowed to heal. His back sent shooting pains down his legs during certain exercises. Medical professionals would have told Roy he was being reckless, risking permanent damage, ignoring his body signals that he was pushing too hard. Roy didn't care. He'd been told his entire life what he couldn't do, couldn't succeed in school, couldn't escape poverty, couldn't be anything more than a farm laborer. The Army had been the one place that judged him on performance rather than ethnicity or background. If he couldn't be a soldier, he'd lost the only place he'd ever belonged. By late 1966, Roy could run 2 miles. Not fast. His time was well over 20 minutes, nowhere near the 16-minute standard. But he could run. He could do 50 push-ups, 60 sit-ups, pull himself up on a bar. He could march with a pack, though his back ached afterwards. He was nowhere near Special Forces standards, but he was functional as a soldier. Roy went to his commanding officer and requested to return to active duty. The CO looked at Roy's medical file, multiple surgeries, severe injuries, recommendation for medical retirement, and was skeptical. He ordered Roy to take the standard Army physical fitness test. If Roy could pass the minimum standards, the CO would consider his request. Roy passed. Barely, but he passed. He ran 2 miles in 17 minutes and change, 1 minute over the Airborne standard, but under the regular Army maximum. He did the minimum required push-ups and sit-ups. He proved he was physically capable of being a soldier. The CO approved Roy's return to active duty, but not to Special Forces. Roy's injuries were too severe for the physical demands of Special Forces operations. He was reassigned to a support role, working as an advisor to other units. It wasn't what Roy wanted, but it was better than medical retirement. Roy spent 6 months in the support role, hating every minute. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a clerk with combat experience. He watched other Special Forces soldiers prepare for deployments to Vietnam, trained for missions, lived the life Roy wanted to live. He became depressed, angry, frustrated. Then Roy heard that Special Forces was conducting a requalification physical fitness test for soldiers who'd been injured and recovered. If you could pass Special Forces standards, higher than regular Army standards, you could return to SF duty regardless of your medical history. The test would be brutal. Most soldiers who'd been seriously injured couldn't pass it, but it was a chance. Roy trained for months, pushing his body harder than doctors would have approved. He ran until his leg went numb. He did pull-ups until his hands bled. He marched with progressively heavier packs until his back screamed. He ignored pain, ignored common sense, ignored every reasonable limitation a recovering patient should have respected. In early 1968, Roy took the Special Forces requalification test. He passed, not with spectacular scores, but solidly. He proved he could meet the standards. The Army, desperate for experienced Special Forces soldiers as the Vietnam War escalated, reinstated Roy to full SF duty. In February 1968, Roy deployed to South Vietnam for his second combat tour. He was assigned to be 56, 5th Special Forces Group, operating out of Loc Ninh near the Cambodian border. This was one of the most dangerous areas of operation, close to enemy sanctuaries in Cambodia, frequent contact with North Vietnamese Army regulars, constant danger from ambushes and attacks. Roy was 32 years old. Most men his age with his injuries would have been retired. Roy was back in combat, doing the job he'd fought for 2 years to return to. His leg still hurt. His back still ached. He'd probably shortened his lifespan by refusing to accept his limitations. Roy didn't care. He was a soldier again. That was all that mattered. May 2nd, 1968, started as a routine day at Forward Operating Base Loc Ninh. Roy wasn't scheduled for any missions. He was working in the operations center, monitoring radio traffic, coordinating with other units. It was administrative work, the kind of duty that bored Roy, but that someone had to do. At approximately 0600 hours, a radio call came in that changed everything. A 12-man Special Forces reconnaissance team, called Sign Zulu, was in trouble. Serious trouble. They'd been inserted by helicopter the previous day to observe North Vietnamese Army movements near the Cambodian border. Their mission was simple: watch, report, stay hidden. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Something had gone wrong. Zulu had been discovered. They'd been surrounded by what initial estimates suggested was an entire NBA battalion. Anywhere from 300 to 1,000 enemy soldiers. Zulu was trapped in a clearing, taking casualties, unable to move. They needed immediate extraction, or they'd be overrun and killed. The problem was that extracting Zulu meant flying helicopters into a landing zone that was hot, under active enemy fire, surrounded by enemy forces, in terrain that favored ambush. It was a kind of mission pilots called suicide runs. The first helicopter that tried to extract Zulu had taken so much fire had been forced to abort. The second helicopter's pilot had been killed before he could even land. Roy listened to the radio traffic. He heard Zulu's team leader, voice calm despite the situation, reporting that half his team was wounded. They were running low on ammunition, and NVA forces were closing in. He heard helicopter pilots reporting that the landing zone was too hot, that they couldn't get in without taking catastrophic fire, That extraction wasn't feasible. He heard someone say that Zulu would have to be left behind, that there was no way to get them out, that 12 American soldiers were going to die. Roy stood up from his desk, grabbed his web gear and rifle, and headed for the helicopter pad. Someone asked where he was going. Roy said he was going to get Zulu out. Someone pointed out that Roy wasn't on the extraction team. He wasn't assigned to the mission. He wasn't even supposed to be in the field. He was on administrative duty because of his injuries. Roy didn't care. 12 American soldiers were going to die unless someone went in and got them out. Roy had the skills. He had the training. He wasn't going to sit in an air-conditioned operations center while fellow soldiers died because extraction was too dangerous. Roy climbed aboard a UH-1 Huey helicopter that was preparing for another extraction attempt. The pilot looked at him and asked if he was authorized to be there. Roy said yes, a lie, but a pragmatic one. The pilot shrugged and prepared for takeoff. As the helicopter lifted off, Roy checked his equipment. He had his CAR-15 rifle, a shortened version of the M16. He had several magazines of ammunition. He had a medical bag with bandages, morphine, and basic trauma supplies. He had a knife. He was wearing body armor. Though it would only stop small arms fire, not the heavy machine gun rounds and rocket-propelled grenades that were being fired at the landing zone. Roy was violating pretty much every regulation in the book. He'd inserted himself into a mission without authorization. He deployed to a hot landing zone without being part of the assigned team. He decided on his own authority that he was going to conduct a rescue operation that senior commanders had already deemed too risky. If Roy survived, he'd probably face disciplinary action. If he died, he'd die in violation of orders, which meant his family might not receive full benefits. Roy didn't care about any of that. 12 soldiers needed help. Roy was going to help them. Everything else was bureaucracy. The helicopter flew low and fast toward the landing zone. About 15 miles from Loch Ninh, Roy could see smoke rising from the jungle ahead, probably from grenades and mortars. He could hear radio chatter. Zulu reporting they were nearly out of ammunition. NVA forces massing for a final assault, time running out. At 0620 hours, the pilot announced they were approaching the landing zone. He told Roy this was going to be a flyby. The helicopter would swoop in at high speed, not land, and anyone getting off had about 3 seconds to jump before the pilot pulled up and out. Landing was too dangerous. The helicopter would be a stationary target for every NVA soldier within rifle range. Roy said he understood. The helicopter descended rapidly, skimming treetops, approaching the clearing where Zulu was trapped. Roy could see muzzle flashes, hundreds of them, surrounding the clearing. The NVA forces were firing from multiple positions, creating a crossfire that covered every approach to the landing zone. The helicopter came in fast, 15 feet off the ground, rotors screaming. The door gunner was firing his M60 machine gun at enemy positions, trying to suppress fire long enough for Roy to jump. At 0622 hours, Roy jumped from a moving helicopter into a landing zone surrounded by enemy forces that outnumbered him at least 100 to 1. Roy hit the ground running, or tried to. His right leg, still damaged from the landmine injury 2 years earlier, nearly buckled when he landed. Pain shot up his spine. He stumbled, caught his balance, and sprinted toward the tree line where Zulu team was positioned. Machine gun fire tore through the air around him. Bullets hit the ground at his feet, throwing up fountains of dirt. Roy ran in a zigzag pattern, the way he'd been trained, making himself harder to hit. Behind him, the helicopter pulled up sharply and accelerated away, door gunner still firing at enemy positions. Roy reached the tree line and dove into cover. He was breathing hard, adrenaline flooding his system, heart pounding. He'd made it 75 meters across open ground under heavy fire without being hit. That was either extraordinary luck or divine intervention. Roy wasn't sure which and didn't care. He low-crawled toward Zulu's position, following the sound of American weapons. He found them dug in around a large fallen tree, using the trunk as cover while NVA forces fired at them from 3 directions. The team leader, a lieutenant Roy didn't know, looked shocked to see another American appear. "Who the hell are you?" the lieutenant yelled over the gunfire. "Benavidez, B-56. Roy shouted back. "I'm here to get you out." "Just you?" "Just me for now. More helicopters coming. What's your situation?" The situation was catastrophic. Of the 12-man team, 4 dead, 8 were wounded, some seriously. They'd been in contact with NVA forces for about 6 hours, had gone through most of their ammunition, and had only been able to hold their position. because they'd had air support dropping bombs and napalm on NVA positions. But air support had to leave to refuel, and every time the aircraft left, NVA forces pressed closer. Roy assessed the wounded quickly, using his medical training. 2 men had leg wounds, bad but not immediately life-threatening. 1 man had a chest wound, serious, needed evacuation soon. 1 man had been shot in the face, alive but barely conscious. The others had various combinations of gunshot and shrapnel wounds. Roy radioed the helicopter pilot, who was circling the area. "This is Benavidez. I'm with Zulu. Need immediate extraction. 8 wounded for Kia. LZ is hot, but I'll mark it with smoke. You'll have maybe 30 seconds before NVA overruns us." The pilot responded, "Roger that. Coming back in. Get them ready." Roy grabbed smoke grenades and threw them to mark the landing zone, creating a purple smoke cloud that the pilot could aim for. Then he started moving the wounded toward the clearing. The 4 dead soldiers would have to come last, the living to priority. The first man Roy moved was the one with the chest wound. Roy grabbed him in a fireman's carry, hoisting him onto his shoulders, and ran toward the marked landing zone. Halfway there, Roy felt something impact his right leg hard, spinning him partially around. He'd been shot. The bullet went through his right calf, through muscle missing bone. The pain was immediate and intense. Roy kept moving. He got the wounded soldier to the landing zone, laid him down, and turned back for the next one. His right leg was bleeding, his boot filling with blood, but the leg still worked. He ran back to the tree line, limping now but still moving, and grabbed another wounded man. This time he made it 15 feet before automatic weapons fire from multiple NVA positions stitched across his path. Roy felt 2 impacts in quick succession. 1 bullet grazed his head, creasing his scalp and causing blood to pour down his face. Another hit his right thigh, punching through muscle. Roy stumbled, fell, pulled himself back up using the wounded man he was carrying as leverage, and kept moving. He delivered the second wounded man to the landing zone. The helicopter was approaching, coming in fast and low. Roy turned back for a 3rd trip. This pattern continued for the next hour. Roy would run to Zulu's position, grab a wounded man or a body, carry or drag them to the landing zone while taking fire, deliver them to the marked area, and go back for another. Each trip, the NVA fire intensified as enemy forces realized what Roy was doing and tried to stop him. Each trip, Roy took more wounds. 3rd trip, bullet through his left forearm, missing bones but tearing muscle. 4th trip, shrapnel from a grenade that exploded 10 feet away, pepper his back and legs with metal fragments. 5th trip, another bullet through his right shoulder, this one going clean through without hitting anything vital. The pain was accumulating. Roy's body was screaming at him to stop, to take cover, to wait for help. His right leg barely functioned. Blood was flowing from multiple wounds, soaking his uniform, leaving a trail behind him. His vision was blurry from blood running into his eyes from the head wound. Roy kept moving. He'd made a promise to himself when he jumped from that helicopter. Nobody dies today. Not while he could still move, still breathe, still fight. By 0700 hours, 45 minutes after Roy had arrived, he'd moved 6 wounded men and 2 bodies to the extraction point. The helicopter had landed twice, under intense fire, and evacuated 4 wounded. It was returning for a 3rd time to get the rest. Roy went back to the team leader, the lieutenant who'd asked, "Who the hell are you?" when Roy first arrived. The lieutenant had been shot in both legs and couldn't walk. Roy grabbed a fireman's carry and started the journey back to the landing zone. Halfway there, Roy heard a sound he recognized instantly, an incoming RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade. The sound was distinctive, a whooshing noise like a firework that gave you about 1 second to react before the rocket hit and exploded. Roy had 1 second. He threw himself and the wounded lieutenant into a shallow depression in the ground, covering the lieutenant's body with his own. The RPG hit a tree about 20 feet away and exploded. The explosion threw shrapnel in every direction. Roy felt multiple impacts across his back, legs, and arms as metal fragments tore into him. The pain was beyond anything Roy had experienced. Multiple pieces of hot metal were embedded in his flesh, burning. His right leg, already shot twice, now had shrapnel from knee to ankle. His back felt like it was on fire. He couldn't hear anything. The explosion had temporarily deafened him, but he could still move. He pulled himself and the lieutenant out of the depression and kept crawling toward the landing zone. The lieutenant was screaming something Roy couldn't hear. Roy kept crawling, dragging the lieutenant behind him. They reached the landing zone. The helicopter was there, rotors spinning, door gunners firing at NVA positions that were now less than 100 meters away and closing. Roy pushed the lieutenant toward the aircraft door, where crew members grabbed him and pulled him aboard. Roy turned to go back for the last wounded man and the remaining bodies. That's when everything went wrong. An NVA soldier broke through the tree line, running toward the helicopter, bayonet fixed on his AK-47. He was young, probably a teenager, screaming something in Vietnamese. He was 30 feet from Roy, then 20, then 10. Roy raised his AR-15 to shoot, pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The rifle had jammed, probably from mud or damage from the explosions. Roy dropped the useless rifle and drew his knife, a combat knife with a 7-inch blade. The NVA soldier was on Roy before he could set himself. The soldier's bayonet, a long blade designed for close combat, thrust forward, aimed at Roy's chest. Roy tried to dodge, too slow, and the bayonet went into his left side, between his ribs, through his back and out the front of his chest. Roy felt the blade go through him, felt it scrape against his ribs, felt it exit his chest. The NVA soldier was trying to pull the bayonet out for another thrust. Roy, with a bayonet completely through his torso, grabbed the enemy soldier and drove his own knife into the soldier's chest, aiming for the heart. The NVA soldier collapsed. Roy pulled the enemy's bayonet out of his own body, a sensation he would later describe as the worst thing I've ever felt, and dropped it. Blood was pouring from the wound, front and back. Roy pressed his hand against his chest, trying to slow the bleeding, and continued toward Zulu's position for the last man. He found the last wounded soldier and 2 more bodies. The wounded man was semi-conscious, had been shot multiple times, was probably dying. Roy hoisted him onto his shoulders, agony from the bayonet wound, and started back toward the helicopter. NVA forces were everywhere now, running through the trees, firing from multiple directions. The helicopter was taking heavy fire, rotors damaged, windscreen cracked from bullets. The pilot was screaming over the radio that he had to leave immediately or they'd all die. Roy was 50 meters from the helicopter, carrying a wounded man, shot 7 times, stabbed with a bayonet, bleeding from dozens of shrapnel wounds. He couldn't run. His right leg wouldn't support his weight anymore. He could barely walk. He started crawling, dragging the wounded man, leaving a trail of blood behind him. An explosion, mortar round, hit 15 feet to his left. The concussion threw Roy sideways. More shrapnel tore into his already shredded body. His ears were ringing. He couldn't see clearly. His right arm wouldn't work properly. Something was damaged, muscle or nerve or bone. Roy didn't know and didn't care. He kept crawling. The helicopter was 30 meters away. 20. 10. Someone was shooting at him from close range. Roy could see muzzle flashes, could feel bullets hitting the ground around him. One bullet hit his right leg again. He was pretty sure that leg had been shot at least 3 times now. Another bullet hit his web gear, destroying his canteen and one of his ammunition pouches. Roy reached the helicopter. Crew members grabbed the wounded man and pulled him aboard. They reached for Roy. He waved them off. There were still bodies at Zulu's position, still classified documents that couldn't be left for the enemy, still equipment that needed to be secured. Roy crawled back toward the tree line. He gathered classified documents from the dead team leader's body, stuffed them into his shirt. He grabbed radios, heavy, awkward, but necessary, and started dragging them toward the helicopter. That's when he was hit by a rifle, but to the face. An NVA soldier had flanked Roy's position, coming from an unexpected angle, and swung his rifle like a club. The impact shattered Roy's jaw, broke teeth, knocked him to ground. Roy rolled, saw the NVA soldier raising his rifle for another strike, and kicked upward, catching the enemy in the groin. The soldier doubled over. Roy grabbed his drop knife, somehow still in his possession despite everything, and killed the soldier. Roy crawled the last 20 meters to the helicopter, pushing classified documents ahead of him, dragging the radios, leaving smears of blood across the ground. The pilot was screaming that they were out of time, that NVA forces were about to overrun the position, that anyone not on the helicopter in the next 10 seconds would be left behind. Roy reached the helicopter door. Multiple hands grabbed him and dragged him into the cargo bay. The helicopter lurched upward, taking more hits, rotors screaming, barely clearing the trees. As they climbed, Roy could see NVA soldiers running into the now-empty landing zone, firing upward at the departing aircraft. Roy collapsed in the cargo bay, surrounded by wounded men, bleeding from 37 separate wounds. He tried to move and realized his intestines were outside his body. The bayonet wound in his side, combined with the force of the explosions and the physical exertion of carrying wounded men, had torn his abdominal muscles. His intestines had protruded through the wound. Roy had been fighting with his guts literally hanging out. Roy pressed his intestines back inside his body and held his uniform shirt closed over the wound with his hands. He looked around the cargo bay. 8 wounded men, for body bags, classified documents secured, mission equipment recovered. Everyone who could be saved had been saved. Everyone who'd been killed had been brought home for burial. The helicopter landed at Loc Ninh. Medical personnel rushed to the aircraft, started triaging wounded. They worked on the worst cases first. Men with chest wounds, head wounds, severe bleeding. They got to Roy last, assuming he was less critical than the others. A medic checked Roy for vital signs. Found no pulse. Announced that Roy was dead. The medic started placing Roy's body in a body bag. Roy, with 37 wounds, with his intestines held inside his body only by his blood-soaked hands, with blood loss that should have killed him hours ago, summoned the last of strength in his destroyed body. He spat blood in the medic's face. The medic jumped back, startled, then started screaming for doctors. Other medical personnel rushed over. They found a pulse, weak, Freddie, barely present, but there. They found breathing, shallow, irregular, but continuing. Roy Benavidez was alive. They rushed Roy to the operating room. For the next several hours, multiple surgical teams worked on his body, repairing damage that seemed incompatible with life. They counted 7 bullet wounds. They counted 28 pieces of shrapnel, some embedded so deeply they couldn't be removed without causing more damage. They documented the bayonet wound that had gone completely through his torso. They cataloged broken bones, damaged organs, torn muscles. One surgeon later said that Roy's body looked like someone had attacked it with a blender. Another said he'd never seen anyone survive with injuries so severe. A third said that Roy should have been dead 8 or 9 times during the battle, that he continued fighting through wounds that would have killed normal men instantly. Roy survived the surgery. He survived the first night, when infection was a major risk. He survived the first week, when his body should have given up from the trauma and blood loss. 3 weeks later, Roy woke up in a hospital bed. His first question to the nurse, "Did everyone make it?" The nurse told him 8 wounded men survived because of him. 4 men who'd been killed in action had been brought home for burial. Classified documents had been secured. Equipment had been recovered. The mission had been a success. Roy nodded, satisfied, and went back to sleep. Roy spent more than a year recovering from his wounds. The medical process was long, painful, and sometimes seemed endless. Doctors performed multiple surgeries to remove shrapnel, repair damaged organs, reconstruct torn muscles. Physical therapists worked with Roy to rebuild strength and mobility in limbs that had been shattered. Psychiatrists tried to help him process the trauma of 6 hours in hell where he'd been wounded 37 times and still kept fighting. The physical recovery was difficult but straightforward. Roy was young, strong, and determined. He'd recovered from a landmine injury that doctors said would end his career. He could recover from this too, no matter how severe the wounds. The psychological recovery was harder. Roy had nightmares about the battle, reliving the moment the bayonet went through him, the sound of wounded men screaming, the sight of the helicopter nearly leaving without him. He had survivor's guilt, wondering if he could have moved faster, saved more men, prevented the 4 deaths. He was angry at himself for violating orders, angry at the Army for initially trying to prevent the rescue, angry at a system that seemed to value bureaucracy over saving lives. But Roy had something that many trauma survivors didn't have, a clear sense that his actions had mattered. 8 men were alive because of him. For families had bodies to bury rather than sons listed as missing in action. He'd done something objectively, measurably good. That helped. What didn't help was the Army's initial response to Roy's actions. Because Roy had inserted himself into a mission without authorization, because he deployed to a hot landing zone without being part of the assigned team, because he'd violated multiple regulations in conducting his rescue operation, the Army's first instinct was disciplinary action. Some officers argued that Roy should face charges for disobeying orders. Others argued that while his actions had been brave, they'd been reckless and shouldn't be rewarded lest other soldiers think they could ignore the chain of command. The soldiers Roy had saved disagreed. They and their families wrote letters, made phone calls, testified that Roy Benavidez was a hero who deserved recognition, not punishment. The helicopter pilot who'd flown the extraction mission supported Roy's actions. Other Special Forces soldiers who knew Roy vouched for his character and judgment. Eventually, the Army decided not to pursue disciplinary action. Roy received a Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration, for his actions on May 2, 1968. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, while avoiding any mention that he'd acted without orders. Roy was grateful for the recognition, but he and others who'd been there believed the Distinguished Service Cross wasn't sufficient. Roy's actions on May 2, 1968, jumping into a hot landing zone, rescuing 8 wounded men while being wounded 37 times, refusing to quit despite injuries that should have been fatal, met the criteria for Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The problem was politics. The Medal of Honor required extensive documentation, multiple witness statements, and approval at the highest levels of the military and government. In Roy's case, there were complications. Some witnesses had been killed. Others had been so badly wounded they couldn't provide detailed statements. The battle had been chaotic, with limited documentation of exactly what Roy had done and when. More problematically, Roy was Mexican-American. In 1968, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, the military was sensitive to accusations of discrimination. Some officers worried that awarding the Medal of Honor to Roy, who'd violated orders to conduct his rescue, would create a precedent where Hispanic soldiers thought they could ignore the chain of command. Others worried that recognition of Roy's heroism would highlight how many Hispanic soldiers were serving and dying in Vietnam while facing discrimination at home. The initial Medal of Honor recommendation for Roy was denied. Roy left the Army in 1976, medically retired, still suffering from his 1968 wounds and from new injuries accumulated in continued service. He moved to El Paso, Texas, took a job with the Veterans Administration, and tried to build a normal life. But the story of what Roy had done on May 2, 1968, didn't go away. The soldiers he'd saved never forgot. Their families never forgot. Other veterans who knew Roy's story started advocating for proper recognition. In 1980, one of the soldiers Roy had saved, by then a successful civilian with political connections, reached out to the Reagan administration. He provided documentation, witness statements, and a detailed account of Roy's actions. He argued that Roy Benavidez deserved the Medal of Honor, and that the earlier denial had been wrong. The Reagan administration reviewed the case. New evidence had emerged. More witnesses had come forward. The political climate had changed. By 1980, advocating for Hispanic veterans wasn't seen as controversial. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan approved the Medal of Honor for Roy Benavidez, 13 years after the actions that earned it. On February 24, 1981, in a ceremony at the Pentagon, President Reagan presented the Medal of Honor to Roy Benavidez. The citation, the official description of Roy's actions, was one of the longest and most detailed ever written, describing in minute detail the 6 hours of hell where Roy had refused to quit, refused to die, and refused to leave fellow soldiers behind. When President Reagan placed a medal around Roy's neck, he said, "If the story of your heroism were a movie script, the studio would throw out as too far-fetched." Roy's response was characteristically humble. "I just did my job, sir." Roy spent the rest of his life as an advocate for veterans. He traveled to schools, spoke at military events, visited VA hospitals, and worked tirelessly to ensure that soldiers, particularly Hispanic and minority soldiers, received the recognition and benefits they'd earned. He argued that heroism had no ethnicity, that courage had no color, and that every soldier who served deserved respect regardless of their background. He also fought against the glorification of war. Roy was emphatic that war was hell, that combat was traumatic, that PTSD was real and needed to be taken seriously. He wanted people to honor veterans without romanticizing the violence they'd experienced. He wanted young people to understand that military service was noble, but that war itself was terrible. Roy's health declined throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The wounds from 1968 never fully healed. He suffered from chronic pain, had difficulty walking, dealt with ongoing medical issues from the shrapnel still embedded in his body. He developed diabetes, possibly related to exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam. He had multiple surgeries to address complications from his combat wounds. Despite declining health, Roy never stopped working for veterans. When he was too sick to travel, he made phone calls. When he couldn't make calls, he wrote letters. When he couldn't write, he had family members help him communicate. He was driven by the same determination that had kept him fighting on May 2nd, 1968. If he could still move, still breathe, still communicate, he had a responsibility to keep serving. Roy Benavidez died on November 29, 1998, in San Antonio, Texas. He was 63 years old. His death was attributed to complications from diabetes and from the long-term effects of his combat wounds. He lived 30 years after being shot, stabbed, and blown up 37 times. He'd lived to see his children grow up, to receive the nation's highest military honor, to become a respected advocate for veterans. His funeral was attended by hundreds of veterans, military officials, and civilians whose lives Roy had touched. 8 men, now middle-aged, with families and careers, serve as pallbearers. These were the men Roy had saved on May 2nd, 1968. They'd promised Roy they would carry him one final time. President Clinton issued a statement praising Roy's service and sacrifice. The governor of Texas declared a day of mourning. The city of El Paso renamed a park in Roy's honor. The U.S. Navy commissioned a ship, the USNS Benavidez, named after Roy, a rare honor for a soldier rather than a naval officer. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from one of the soldiers Roy had saved, who spoke at Roy's funeral. Roy used to say he wasn't a hero, that he was just doing his job. But his job was being a soldier, and he did it better than any man I've ever known. He saved 8 of us that day in May 1968. But he saved a lot more than that over the years, by showing us what courage looks like, what determination means, and what it truly means to refuse to quit no matter what. Roy Benavidez's legacy extends far beyond his Medal of Honor and his 6 hours of heroism on May 2nd, 1968. He represents something fundamental about the American story. The idea that circumstances of birth don't determine your worth, that determination can overcome terrible odds, and that heroism exists in people society often overlooks. Roy was everything society told him he couldn't be. He was an orphan who wasn't supposed to succeed. He was a Mexican-American in an era of discrimination who wasn't supposed to earn respect. He was a high school dropout who wasn't supposed to amount to anything. He was a wounded soldier who wasn't supposed to walk again, much less fight again. Every time someone told Roy no, he took it as a challenge to prove them wrong. Told he'd never walk again, he ran. Told a mission was impossible, he completed it. Told he didn't deserve recognition, he fought for 10 years until he got it. Roy's story has inspired generations of soldiers, particularly Hispanic and Latino service members, who saw in Roy someone who looked like them, who came from similar backgrounds, who proved that heroism wasn't limited to any particular ethnicity or class. The Medal of Honor ceremony in 1981 was a watershed moment for recognition of Hispanic military service, opening doors for other deserving soldiers to receive recognition that had been denied because of discrimination. Military training now uses Roy's story as a case study in several areas. In leadership courses to teach decision-making under pressure, in medical training to demonstrate what the human body can endure, in ethics courses to discuss when violating orders is justified, and in cultural diversity training to highlight the contributions of Hispanic service members. Roy's actions on May 2nd, 1968 also raised profound questions about courage, duty, and sacrifice. Was Roy's decision to jump into that landing zone brave or reckless? He violated orders, risked his life, and could have been killed, which would have meant his wife was left a widow and his children without a father. Some argue his actions were irresponsible, but the 8 men Roy saved would disagree. Their children, who exist because Roy rescued their fathers, would disagree. The families who got to bury their loved ones rather than have them listed as missing in action would disagree. Roy himself addressed this question late in his life. When asked if he'd do it again, knowing the cost, 37 wounds, years of pain, permanent disability, Roy's answer was immediate. Without hesitation, those were my brothers. You don't leave your brothers behind. Ever. That simple statement, you don't leave your brothers behind, captures the essence of Roy Benavidez's character and the values he lived by. He believed in duty, in sacrifice, in the bond between soldiers that transcended ethnicity, rank, or background. He believed that some things mattered more than personal safety, that some causes were worth suffering for, that some fights were worth fighting even when the odds were overwhelming. Roy Benavidez proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's continuing despite fear. He proved that toughness isn't about being the strongest, it's about refusing to quit. He proved that heroism isn't about seeking glory, it's about doing what needs to be done when no one else will do it. The orphan who picked cotton, the dropout who couldn't read well, the wounded soldier who wasn't supposed to walk again, became Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez, Medal of Honor recipient, and one of the most decorated soldiers in American history. He refused to accept limitations. He refused to quit. He refused to leave anyone behind. And on May 2nd, 1968, when Roy Benavidez spat blood in a medic's face to prove he was still alive, he sent a message that would echo through the decades. You can wound me, You can break me. You can do everything possible to kill me, but I will not quit. I will not surrender. And I will not die until my mission is complete. That's the legacy of Roy Benavidez. That's the standard he set. That's the example he gave us all. The man who refused to die.